Thunder crashed like a gavel pronouncing judgment on a dying land as Benjamin Porter rode into the town of Bonanza, Colorado, his once steady gun hand trembling against the worn leather reins. The year was 1878, and like many men who'd survived the Civil War only to find themselves adrift in a rapidly changing West, Benjamin wore the haunted expression of someone who'd seen too much of life's harsh realities. Rain pounded the dusty main street, turning it to sucking mud that threatened to pull the shoes right off his exhausted chestnut mare. Benjamin squinted through the downpour at the row of weathered buildings. A hotel, a saloon, a general store, all the trappings of civilization. Yet he felt no more at home here than he had in any of the dozen towns he'd drifted through since leaving Kansas. "Easy, Sadie," he murmured to his horse as another crash of thunder startled her. His right hand jerked involuntarily, the familiar tremor worsening as it always did when memories threatened to overtake him. He flexed his fingers, willing them to steadiness, but the trembling persisted, a permanent souvenir from Antietam, though not from any bullet. The Golden Nugget Saloon beckoned with warm light spilling from its windows. Benjamin dismounted stiffly, his 35 years feeling more like 60 as his boots hit the mud. He looped Sadie's reins around the hitching post and patted her wet neck. "Won't be long," he promised, though he had no idea if that was true. He had nowhere particular to go and no one waiting for him. Just another drifter looking for work, for whiskey, for something to quiet the memories that chased him across the frontier. The saloon's batwing doors swung open as Benjamin approached, revealing a young woman struggling with several heavy packages. She wore a sensible dark blue dress, her honey-brown hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet, and she looked nothing like the painted doves he was accustomed to seeing in such establishments. "Madam," he said, reaching to steady her as she nearly lost her balance. "Allow me." Her head jerked up in surprise, revealing a face that might have been plain at first glance, but held a certain quiet dignity that caught Benjamin off guard. Her eyes were an unusual shade that reminded him of summer storms. "Thank you, but I can manage," she replied, her voice carrying the crisp edge of formal education, something rare in these parts. "I don't doubt it, madam, but this rain's getting worse." Benjamin reached for the largest package, his hand betraying him with a visible shake. He saw her notice, felt the familiar shame rise up his neck, but he met her gaze steadily. "Just trying to be of service." Something in her expression softened. "In that case, I would appreciate the help. I'm heading to the schoolhouse, just down the street." "Schoolhouse?" Benjamin echoed, surprised. Last he'd heard, Bonanza was little more than a mining camp with aspirations. "Yes, I'm Hannah Morgan, the new teacher." She shifted her remaining packages. The town council decided it was time the children had proper schooling, especially now that the silver mines are bringing in more families. Benjamin nodded and introduced himself as they stepped back into the rain. As they walked, he noted how Hannah navigated the muddy street with the determined air of someone who refused to be daunted by difficult circumstances. He found himself curious about what had brought an educated woman to this rough-edged mining town. The schoolhouse was a simple frame building at the edge of town, newly constructed but already showing signs of hasty workmanship. Benjamin helped Hannah inside and set down her packages on a desk at the front of the room. "You're new to Bonanza?" she asked, removing her bonnet and shaking raindrops from it. "Just rode in." Benjamin flexed his right hand unconsciously. "Looking for work." "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Porter?" The question seemed simple enough, but Benjamin felt the weight of all he could no longer be pressing down on him. "Used to be a lawman. Before that, a soldier." He didn't elaborate on why both those careers were behind him now. Hannah studied him with those storm-colored eyes. "The town could use a deputy. Sheriff Ellis was complaining just yesterday about handling everything alone now that the population is growing." Benjamin laughed without humor. I ain't the man I was, Miss Morgan. He held up his trembling right hand as evidence. Some things can't be fixed. Hannah's expression didn't change to pity as he'd expected. Instead, she said quietly, That's the point, Mr. Porter. None of us are who we once were. The question is who we choose to become next. The words struck Benjamin with unexpected force. Before he could respond, the schoolhouse door banged open, admitting a harried-looking man in his 40s. Miss Morgan, didn't expect to find you here with the weather turning so foul. The man eyed Benjamin suspiciously. Who might this be? Sheriff Ellis, Hannah said smoothly. May I introduce Mr. Benjamin Porter, newly arrived in Bonanza? He was kind enough to help me with my supplies. The sheriff's expression remained wary. Appreciate the assistance to our teacher, Porter. You passing through or planning to stay? Haven't decided yet, Benjamin answered honestly. Depends on work. Sheriff Ellis's eyes flicked to Benjamin's holstered revolver, noting the worn grip that spoke of long use. You handy with that piece? Or is it just for show? Benjamin felt Hannah watching him. Used to be, he said carefully. Used to be ain't much use to anyone, Ellis replied, but his tone had softened slightly. Still, if you're looking for honest work, stop by my office tomorrow. Might have something temporary, at least. He turned to Hannah. I'll escort you to your boarding house, Miss Morgan. Mrs. Perkins will be worried. Hannah gathered her things. Thank you, Sheriff. She looked at Benjamin. And thank you, Mr. Porter. Perhaps we'll meet again soon. As Benjamin watched them leave, he considered heading back to the saloon for the whiskey he'd originally sought. Instead, he found himself walking to the livery to stable Sadie properly for the night. Hannah Morgan's words echoed in his mind. The question is who we choose to become next. The livery owner, a grizzled old-timer named Fergus, charged Benjamin a fair price for Sadie's care and directed him to the only boarding house in town that might have a vacancy, Mrs. Perkins's establishment, the same place where the schoolteacher was staying. Respectable place, Fergus warned. No drunkenness, no women, no trouble. Mrs. Perkins runs a tight ship, but the beds are clean and the food's good. Benjamin nodded his thanks and headed toward the two-story clapboard house at the end of the main street. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and lights were coming on in windows all through town as evening settled over Bonanza. Mrs. Perkins turned out to be a formidable widow in her 50s who scrutinized Benjamin as if he were a suspicious package that might contain dynamite. I run a respectable house, Mr. Porter, she said after he inquired about a room. No drinking, no carousing, and payment in advance. Yes, madam, Benjamin agreed, placing coins on her desk. I understand the schoolteacher boards here as well. Miss Morgan? Indeed, a lovely young woman and a credit to our town. We're fortunate to have someone of her caliber teaching our children. Mrs. Perkins's expression softened momentarily. She's had her share of hardships, that one, but never complains. Shows real character. Benjamin wondered what hardships a young schoolteacher might have endured but knew better than to ask. Mrs. Perkins showed him to a small but clean room on the second floor, informing him that dinner would be served promptly at 6. When Benjamin entered the dining room later, Hannah was already seated at the large table, along with 4 other boarders, 2 shop clerks, a telegrapher, and an elderly gentleman who turned out to be the town doctor. Hannah looked up in surprise when Benjamin appeared, but then smiled in welcome. Mr. Porter, I didn't realize you'd be staying here. Your recommendation of Bonanza's employment opportunities was persuasive, he replied, taking the empty seat across from her. I'll be speaking with Sheriff Ellis tomorrow. The conversation flowed easily around the table as Mrs. Perkins served a hearty stew. Benjamin found himself watching Hannah, noting how she engaged everyone with genuine interest. When the telegrapher mentioned trouble with local outlaws who'd been robbing freight wagons, Benjamin caught her glancing at his trembling hand, which he'd kept mostly hidden beneath the table. After dinner, while the others retired to the parlor, Hannah approached Benjamin as he stood by the window, watching the last of the storm clouds drift away to reveal stars bright as silver dollars. "Sheriff Ellis is a good man," she said, "but overwhelmed. The mining companies keep bringing in more workers, and where there's silver, there's trouble." Benjamin turned to face her. "Why Bonanza, Miss Morgan? You don't strike me as someone who'd choose a rough mining town if you had other options." Hannah's smile faded slightly. "Everyone has a past, Mr. Porter. Mine led me here." She paused. "May I ask about your hand?" Benjamin almost refused, but something in her direct gaze made evasion seem cowardly. "Most assume it's from a bullet or shrapnel. It's not." He flexed his fingers, watching them tremble. "It started after Antietam. The doctors called it soldier's heart. When you've seen too much death, sometimes your body betrays you." Hannah nodded. "The war damaged many men in ways that don't show on the outside. Makes it hard to hold a gun steady," Benjamin admitted. "Ended my time as a marshal in Dodge City. Hard to uphold the law when you can't shoot straight." "Is that all you believe you're good for? Shooting?" Hannah challenged gently. "Perhaps Bonanza needs something different from its lawmen." Before Benjamin could respond, Mrs. Perkins appeared to announce that a gentleman caller was asking for Hannah in the parlor. Hannah excused herself, leaving Benjamin to ponder her words. The following morning, Benjamin presented himself at the sheriff's office. Ellis was sorting through wanted posters, his desk cluttered with paperwork. "Porter, wasn't sure you'd show." Ellis gestured to a chair. "Been thinking about our conversation yesterday. You said you were a marshal in Dodge." "For 3 years," Benjamin confirmed. "Under who?" "Worked with Wyatt Earp for a time." Ellis's eyebrows rose. "That so? Why'd you leave?" Benjamin held up his trembling hand. "This makes shooting straight a challenge." Ellis studied him for a long moment. "Shooting ain't all there is to keeping the peace. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to draw." He leaned back in his chair. "I need someone to help keep an eye on things, especially on paydays when the miners come to town. Someone who knows how to talk men down before trouble starts." "And if talking doesn't work?" Benjamin asked. "Then I handle it," Ellis said simply. "I'm offering 2 months' trial as my deputy. After that, we'll see." Benjamin considered the offer. It wasn't what he'd expected, more of a peacekeeper than a gunslinger, but perhaps that was the point. "When do I start?" "Today. Badge is in the drawer. Pays not much, but includes room and board." Ellis stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to Bonanza, Deputy Porter." The news of Benjamin's appointment spread quickly through the small town. When Hannah encountered him later that day outside the general store, now wearing a deputy's star, she smiled. "It suits you," she said, nodding toward the badge. "We'll see," Benjamin replied. "Sheriff seems to think I can be useful despite this." He flexed his hand. "Perhaps because of it," Hannah suggested. "A man who knows his limitations often finds wisdom others lack." Over the next few weeks, Benjamin settled into his role as deputy. The tremor in his hand remained, but he discovered that Hannah had been right. Many situations required judgment more than gunplay. He became a familiar figure in Bonanza, walking the streets, checking businesses at closing time, and ensuring miners' payday celebrations didn't turn too rowdy. He also found himself crossing paths with Hannah frequently. Sometimes they'd chat when he escorted children back to school after they'd played hooky, or when he helped carry supplies for her classroom. Occasionally, they'd share conversations in Mrs. Perkins's parlor in the evenings. Benjamin learned that Hannah had come from Boston, where she'd been engaged to a banker's son who died suddenly of typhoid fever. The scandal that followed involving her former fiancé's secret gambling debts and unsavory associations had left her reputation tarnished through no fault of her own. Bonanza represented a fresh start, far from the whispers and judgment of Boston society. "So we're both running from something," Benjamin observed one evening as they sat on Mrs. Perkins's porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight. "Not running," Hannah corrected. "Building something new from the ruins of what was lost." Their friendship deepened as summer gave way to autumn. Benjamin found himself looking forward to their conversations, admiring Hannah's resilience and intelligence. For her part, Hannah seemed to appreciate his quiet strength and the gentle way he handled the town's children, who had taken to following him on his rounds. The first real test of Benjamin's new role came in October, when a group of rough men rode into town, led by a notorious outlaw named Jackson Blackwell. They'd been terrorizing settlements throughout Colorado, and now they'd set their sights on Bonanza's thriving businesses. Sheriff Ellis was away, escorting a prisoner to Denver, leaving Benjamin alone to face the threat. He stood in the middle of the street as the riders approached, his badge gleaming in the autumn sunlight, his right hand trembling visibly at his side. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Welcome to Bonanza. I'll ask you to check your weapons at my office while you're in town." Laughter rippled through the group of riders. Blackwell, a bear of a man with a scarred face, leaned forward in his saddle. "That's mighty hospitable, Deputy Shaky," he said, deliberately eyeing Benjamin's trembling hand. "But we'll keep our irons, thanks all the same." Benjamin didn't move. "That wasn't a request." "And how do you plan to enforce that?" Blackwell sneered. "Word is, you can't even hold a gun straight." "Don't need to," Benjamin replied calmly, "because you're going to turn around and ride out the way you came." More laughter, but Benjamin noticed several townspeople had emerged from businesses along the street. The blacksmith stood outside his shop, hammer in hand. The grocer and his sons had appeared, armed with shotguns. And there was Hannah, standing on the schoolhouse steps with her students safely inside, watching the confrontation with concern etched on her face. Blackwell noticed too. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. "Seems you've got friends, Deputy." "That's the difference between you and me," Benjamin said. "I'm part of something. You're just passing through, taking what isn't yours because you never learned how to build anything worthwhile." Blackwell's hand drifted toward his pistol, but Benjamin didn't reach for his own weapon. Instead, he said quietly, "You draw on me. These good people will cut you down before you clear leather. And even if you get lucky, there's nowhere you can run that the law won't follow." Tension crackled between them like heat lightning. Then, surprisingly, Blackwell laughed. "Well, ain't you something? Deputy with the shakes giving me a lecture on consequences." He studied Benjamin for a moment longer, then straightened in his saddle. "Boys, I believe we've worn out our welcome in this particular shithole town." "Smart decision," Benjamin said evenly. "Don't come back." Blackwell reined his horse around. "This ain't over, Deputy Shaky." With that parting threat, he led his men out of town at an unhurried pace that suggested retreat had been their own choice. Once they were gone, Benjamin felt his legs go weak with relief. The townspeople approached, clapping him on the back and expressing their gratitude. Hannah made her way to his side, concern and admiration mingling in her gaze. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said softly. "Probably both," Benjamin admitted, his hand trembling more violently now that the danger had passed. "But sometimes the appearance of strength is enough." Hannah touched his arm gently. "What you did today wasn't an appearance. It was real courage." That evening, most of the town gathered at the Golden Nugget to celebrate their deputy's stand against Blackwell's gang. Benjamin, uncomfortable with the attention, slipped out early and found himself walking toward the schoolhouse, drawn by the light in its windows. Hannah was there, preparing lessons for the following day. She looked up when he entered, her face softening into a smile that made his heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with his condition. "Our local hero," she said, but her tone held no mockery. "Hardly," Benjamin replied, taking a seat on one of the children's benches. "I got lucky. Blackwell could have called my bluff." "It wasn't luck," Hannah insisted. "It was understanding people. Knowing that even men like Blackwell calculate risks and rewards." She set down her chalk and moved to sit beside him. "You didn't need a steady gun hand. You needed judgment and courage, which you have in abundance." Benjamin looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside him. Hannah wasn't conventionally beautiful, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that made her lovely to him. "What happens when they come back?" he asked. "Blackwell isn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered." "Then Bonanza will stand together again," Hannah said simply. "You've shown people what's possible when someone leads with conviction rather than force." Benjamin's hand trembled between them on the bench. Without hesitation, Hannah covered it with her own, steadying it with her touch. "I meant what I said months ago," she told him. "None of us are who we once were. I'm not the proper Boston lady whose future was all mapped out. You're not the gunslinger whose worth was measured by his aim. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be." Benjamin turned his hand beneath hers until their palms met. "Hannah," he said, her given name feeling right on his lips for the first time. "I believe I'm becoming someone new in Bonanza, someone I might actually respect." "I already respect him," she replied softly. Their first kiss was tentative, gentle, the meeting of two people who had learned the hard way that life offers no guarantees. When they parted, Benjamin felt steadier than he had in years. Sheriff Ellis returned 3 days later to find his deputy had become something of a town hero. He listened to the account of Blackwell's visit with a grim expression. "You did well, Porter, but you're right about one thing: Blackwell will be back, and with more men. He doesn't take kindly to being faced down, especially by a deputy with a tremor." He sighed heavily. "We should wire for federal marshals." "By the time they get here, it could be too late," Benjamin pointed out. "We need to prepare the town." Together, they developed a plan. Benjamin worked with the townspeople to establish defensive positions and evacuation procedures. Hannah organized the older students to help younger children reach safety if trouble came. The minors, many of whom were veterans like Benjamin, volunteered to form a militia. As expected, Blackwell returned 2 weeks later with double the men. This time, they didn't bother with pretense. They rode in shooting, clearly intending to make an example of Bonanza. But the town was ready. Blackwell's men found themselves facing determined resistance from all sides. Benjamin, despite his trembling hand, managed to organize the defense effectively, positioning sharpshooters on rooftops and coordinating volleys of fire that kept the outlaws pinned down. The battle turned when Blackwell himself spotted Benjamin directing townspeople from behind a water trough. The outlaw leader charged, guns blazing, determined to eliminate the deputy who'd humiliated him. Benjamin drew his revolver, knowing his chances of hitting Blackwell were slim. His hand shook violently as he aimed, but he forced himself to remember what Hannah had told him about finding new strengths. He waited until Blackwell was almost upon him, then fired 3 rapid shots. The first 2 missed, but the third caught Blackwell in the shoulder, throwing him from his horse. Before the outlaw could recover, several miners tackled him, securing his weapons. With their leader captured, the remaining outlaws lost heart and fled. Bonanza had survived, though not without damage. Several buildings had been hit by gunfire, and 3 townspeople were wounded, though thankfully none fatally. Benjamin found Hannah in the aftermath, helping the doctor tend to the injured. When she saw him, blood splattered on his shirt but otherwise unharmed. She threw propriety to the wind and embraced him fiercely. "You're all right," she breathed against his chest. "Better than all right," he replied, holding her close with arms that felt remarkably steady. "I actually hit what I was aiming at." She pulled back to look at him. "I never doubted you would when it truly mattered." That evening, as the town began cleaning up, Sheriff Ellis approached Benjamin with an unusual proposition. "Town council met in emergency session," he said. "They want to offer you a permanent position not just as deputy, but as town marshal with your own deputies. They were impressed with how you organized things today." Benjamin blinked in surprise. "What about you?" Ellis smiled tiredly. "I'm getting old, Porter. Been thinking about retiring to my sister's place in Missouri. This seems like the right time, especially with someone capable ready to take over." "I don't know what to say," Benjamin admitted. "Say yes," Ellis advised. "You've found your place here. Anyone can see that." Later, Benjamin told Hannah about the offer as they walked along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse, the setting sun painting the water with streaks of gold and crimson. "Will you accept?" she asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. "I'm considering it," he said, then smiled at her skeptical look. "All right, yes. I want to stay in Bonanza. I want to be part of building something here." He hesitated, then added, "But my decision depends partly on you." "On me?" Hannah raised an eyebrow. Benjamin took her hands in his, noting with surprise that his right hand was almost steady. "I've come to care for you, Hannah. More than care. If I stay, I want to know if there might be a future for us together." Hannah's eyes softened. "Benjamin Porter, are you asking to court me properly?" "I am," he confirmed. "Though I recognize a former gunslinger with a trembling hand isn't what most women dream of." Hannah laughed, the sound bright in the gathering dusk. "I stopped believing in childhood dreams long ago. I prefer the reality before me, a man who found his courage not despite his limitations, but through them." She squeezed his hands. "Yes, I would be honored to be courted by you, Marshal Porter." As autumn deepened into winter, Benjamin settled into his role as town marshal while courting Hannah with a devotion that became the talk of Bonanza. He escorted her to church socials and town meetings. She helped him practice his reading and writing, skills he'd neglected over years of drifting. Together, they became fixtures in the community, respected and well-liked. Benjamin's hands still trembled, especially when he was tired or stressed, but he had developed ways to work around it. More importantly, he'd stopped seeing it as a mark of weakness. As Hannah had helped him understand, it was simply part of who he was now, a reminder of survival rather than failure. Their courtship flourished amid the life of the growing town. When Benjamin finally proposed on Christmas Eve, during the town's holiday celebration, Hannah's joyful acceptance was met with cheers from what seemed like all of Bonanza. They were married in the spring of 1879, with Sheriff Ellis, now retired but still respected, giving the bride away and Mrs. Perkins shedding uncharacteristic tears of happiness. The entire town turned out for the celebration, transforming the main street into a feast that lasted well into the night. Benjamin and Hannah moved into a small house near both the school and the marshal's office, a wedding gift from the grateful town council. There, they began building the life neither had thought possible after their respective losses and disappointments. Over the next 2 years, Bonanza continued to grow. The silver mines brought prosperity, and Benjamin's reputation as a fair but firm marshal attracted families looking for a safe place to settle. Hannah's school expanded to require a second teacher, and she took particular pride in creating educational opportunities for girls that went beyond basic reading and figures. Their first child, a son they named William, was born in the winter of 1880, bringing a joy to their lives that neither had anticipated. Benjamin, holding his son with hands that trembled slightly from emotion more than his condition, felt a sense of completion he'd never thought possible. "He's perfect," he whispered to an exhausted but radiant Hannah. "Of course he is," she replied, touching their son's tiny fingers. "He comes from love." As William grew into a toddler, Benjamin found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this life. He remembered riding into Bonanza that stormy day, a broken man with no future he could envision. Now he had purpose, respect, love, all the things he'd believed lost to him after the war changed him forever. One summer evening in 1882, as they sat on their porch watching William play in the yard, Hannah caught Benjamin flexing his right hand, something he still did unconsciously when deep in thought. "Penny for your thoughts, Marshall," she said, using the title that still made him stand a little straighter. "Just thinking about the day we met," he replied. "How I told you I wasn't the man I was. And I told you that was the point," Hannah finished, smiling as she reached for his hand. Benjamin nodded, lacing his fingers through hers. "You were right. The man I was couldn't have built this life, couldn't have loved you properly, couldn't have been a father to William. The tremor made you find different strengths," Hannah observed. "It made you listen more carefully, think more deliberately, find solutions beyond the obvious." "It helped me find you," Benjamin said simply. They sat together as twilight descended, their son's laughter mingling with the evening sounds of Bonanza, a town that had given a broken man and a wounded woman the chance to heal each other and build something lasting from the ruins of their pasts. As the years passed, Benjamin and Hannah's family grew to include a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1883, and another son, James, who arrived in 1885. Their home became known as a place of warmth and welcome, with Hannah often tutoring children who needed extra help and Benjamin mentoring young men who needed guidance. Benjamin's reputation as Marshal Porter spread throughout Colorado. Though his hand still trembled when he drew his gun, he'd become known for resolving most situations without violence, a rarity in frontier law enforcement. When dangerous situations did arise, he relied on careful planning and the community's support rather than fast reflexes. By 1890, Bonanza had transformed from a rough mining camp to a proper town with a brick schoolhouse, a bank, and even a small library that Hannah had helped establish. Benjamin and Hannah, now in their 40s, had become pillars of the community they'd helped shape. On their 15th wedding anniversary, the town held a celebration in their honor. As Benjamin stood to address the gathering, he felt the familiar tremor in his right hand. Without hesitation, Hannah reached over and took it in hers, steadying him as she had countless times before. 15 years ago, Benjamin began, I rode into Bonanza believing my best days were behind me. I was wrong. He looked at Hannah, then at their children seated in the front row. What I found here wasn't just a second chance, it was the chance to become someone better than I'd ever been before. Hannah squeezed his hand. And what I found, she added, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, was a man whose true strength had nothing to do with how steadily he could hold a gun. As they looked out at the faces of friends and neighbors who had become like family, Benjamin Porter knew with absolute certainty that his trembling hand had led him not to limitation, but to liberation and to the love that had transformed his life completely. Years later, long after Benjamin had finally retired as marshal and their children had grown into adults with families of their own, he and Hannah still walked together each evening through the streets of Bonanza. Residents would wave and call out greetings to the elderly couple who had helped shape their town's character. On one such evening, as they passed the old schoolhouse where they had first begun to fall in love, Benjamin stopped and turned to Hannah, his right hand still trembling slightly after all these years. Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been if my hand hadn't shaken that day in the rain? He asked. Hannah, her hair now silver but her storm-colored eyes unchanged, smiled the smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "No," she said simply, "because that trembling hand was what made you reach for something steadier than a gun. It made you reach for connection, for community." She took his hand in hers. "For me." Benjamin nodded, understanding as always the wisdom in her words. "You were right all those years ago," he said softly. "I wasn't the man I was. And that was exactly the point." Together, they continued their walk through the town they had helped build, a testament to the truth that our greatest strengths often emerge from what we once perceived as our deepest weaknesses, and that love is found not in perfection, but in the courage to reach out with trembling hands and hold fast to what truly matters.